Okay, so let's get started then. First off, I just wanted to go over some of the tools that I'll be using today to demonstrate NativeScript Angular. To start, I'll be using NativeScript Sidekick here. This is a tool that someday we'll go in more in depth about explaining its capabilities. But essentially what we use it for is to run the project, to actually install it onto your emulators. It also can manage starting up whatever emulators you'd like to use in both iOS and Android. And you'll see I'll switch between those in a little bit as well. We can also use it for a few other things like installing plugins, which we'll demonstrate later. And you can just set some basic build settings as you go. It's also a great tool when it comes time to publish your application. It does a lot of the nitty-gritty details for you. Also today I'll be doing most of my work here in Visual Studio Code. It's just my preferred editor. There's nothing specifically that you need Visual Studio Code for, but I just like it. And also, as far as the emulators we'll be running on, we'll be using a Google Pixel 2, as you can see here, and we'll also be using an iPhone 11. Besides that, I'll also be referring to the NativeScript docs quite a bit. So this project right here, you can see that I've titled Side Drawer Demo, is available on the GitLab from our team. I will share a link on the NativeScript Meetup page, so if any of you want to hop over there and clone the repo so that you can be looking through it on your computer as well as we talk about these things, that'd be great. If any of you want to do that, go ahead and just raise your hand and ask Dave or whoever's running the video to pause it for you so that you can get that downloaded. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the template I used for this. In our last meetup, we discussed how you get NativeScript installed and running and set up so that you can just use one of their templates. For this one, I used the NativeScript Side Drawer Angular template. What that does is it just installs the application with a side drawer already built in, as you can see here. It comes with these pages already added in the side drawer there. It's just a nice basic setup to have 4 pages ready to go to be able to demo some stuff. So today I'd like to just go into a few UI components that you can use through NativeScript. What these do is they access the native APIs of both Android and iOS. So you only have to program it once in the HTML in your TypeScript, and then NativeScript does some magic and accesses the native APIs for you on either device. So today, I'll be walking through mostly on the iPhone, so I'm going to go ahead and shut down this Android emulator and get an iPhone running. Okay, now we just select our device we'd like to start on, and say run device, and it'll get it started for us. I'll clear out this console from previous work. Alright, there we go. We got it synced up to our application. So you can see here on this main home page, I've put in a few different UI components that you can use. And I'm going to walk through each of these, explaining both the Angular and the NativeScript side and how those interact and a few things you can do with them. So to get started up here, you can see we have this slider, and as we pull it, it updates the value up above. It's pretty simple, but can be a useful tool for all sorts of things. And so let's go ahead and break down how exactly this is working. So over here inside of our home component, we have our TypeScript and our HTML files. So I'll open each of those up. Inside of the HTML, here, let me expand that. Inside of our HTML, we can see right here is what we're looking at for the slider. We have that label up above, which is displaying the value that's coming from here. And we also have the slider itself. Excuse me. This is inside of a grid layout, so you'll notice these rows, columns. We don't need to worry about that today. That's just some basic layout stuff. We'll address that in a a future meetup, we'll go into depth on layouts and some tips and tricks for that. But for today, we're just using grid layout, and this just kind of places things in a convenient spot for us. So if you see here on our slider, we have this value attribute, we have a value change attribute, and then a min and a max value. The min and a max are pretty self-explanatory. We're just setting that the 0 and 100 is min-max. But if we come back over here to the value, you'll see that it's using these brackets around it. What those brackets mean is that we're going to use data binding. The brackets imply that the data is going to be one way from the TypeScript component to the HTML. So this is just to display information from the TypeScript component. You can see we're also using that up here on the text. Here on the value change, you'll notice it's inside of parentheses. So the parentheses are one-way data binding the opposite direction. It sends it from the HTML to the TypeScript. And so here we have this value change attribute. This is an event listener for when the value changes on the slider. We call this function the onSlider value change, and we're passing in the event, which contains all the relevant information to this event that fired. If we come over to our TypeScript component and look at the onSlider value change right here, we're not really doing much, but I'll walk you through these steps. So we just take in args, which are those event values, and you can see I've declared it as event data, which is a interface provided by NativeScript. And then here, I'm just taking the args.object is what comes back from this event data and declaring it as type slider. This slider is also imported from NativeScript. You can see up here I have quite a few imports from the TNS core modules, which is NativeScript's package for all of these native components. So I've declared it as type slider so that I'll have access to all the functions and values and attributes that the slider comes with. And what I'm doing in this case with this function is I'm simply setting this class variable we have called slider value to be to equal the value that the slider is sending to us. Up top here, you'll see I've declared a slider value as a number, and I'm defaulting it to a value of 10. But as you saw here, as we drag, we're updating that value to match this. And you can see in the HTML here, as I said before, we have that one-way data binding from component to HTML, binding to that slider value. Just to display another way you could go about this, let me go ahead, I'm going to comment this out, uncomment this next line. So we've just replaced that other slider with a new one, and as opposed to binding to value and then value change, we can leverage something that Angular provides us, which is the ng model. So the ng model just NativeScript explains a little more in their docs if you'd like to go read through in depth what they're doing. But essentially, NativeScript Angular has gone through and made sure that for each of these HTML components, they link the ng model into one of the attributes. And in the case of the slider, it's the value attribute. So the ng model essentially handles both the value and the value change events and says bind that to this slider value. So it'll work just the same. I'll go ahead and save this. You'll see this over here should recompile for us. We got set back to our default of 10, and we can still drag along, and it does the same thing. Personally, I prefer just using ng model in most cases because it's just less code written. But there are some cases where you'd want to use a value change function in case you need to execute additional code on top of just setting a value if there's more functionality needed there. As a side note, when using the ng model attribute, you'll have to make sure to import into the corresponding module in your Angular application the NativeScript forms module. That just adds the ng model into the project so it knows what to do when using that. So if we come back over here to our home page, the next thing you'll see here is just a simple list picker. We can go ahead here, we can choose from our list of Pokemon whatever we'd like, let's say Pikachu, and you'll see this Tap Me button. When I click this, it brings up a dialog box, a little alert that just tells you you chose Pikachu, and that bounced through. if we were to change it here to say Squirtle, you'll see you chose Squirtle comes up. So we're going to go ahead and explain those three things. We have our list picker, our button, and also the dialog. So to start with the list picker, you see here, we just added into the HTML, ignoring the row and column again. We have this value here, items, in brackets. So as we've discussed, brackets just means one-way data binding. We're just going to pass in the array we'd like it to loop through and display. And then we also have a selected index change function that will give us the index of what is selected. So if we come back over here and we look at our selected index changed function, you can see we've done something similar, passed in args of event data, and this time we're assigning it to list picker. Just to briefly explain, you can see here on the slider I used this notation where you use the angle brackets to declare the type, and down here I've used as. These two are interchangeable in TypeScript. There's no difference. I believe you have to use as if you're using JSX, but in most cases they're interchangeable, and here in NativeScript there's no problem using either. I tend to like as a little bit more. It just seems a little clearer in my mind, but both are totally fine. So we've done that here. We've declared our picker object to be of type list picker, and we then, since this gives us the selected index, we're just looking up in our array of Pokemon, which we initialized up here. It points the index and assigns it to the selected Pokemon value, which again is another variable just declared up here. So then our button has just some text there and then a tap event. So tap events, very useful. You'll use them throughout NativeScript, but if you just go ahead, when you tap on something, it'll trigger whatever function you pass it here. You can also execute code in line in the HTML if you'd like, but I think it's best practice to pretty much always call a function from the HTML. So you see here, this is our function that we've called, and in here we're going to create some options to pass into our alert. So what we've done here in our options, these are the three things you can set in an alert dialog. So we've set our title, just some text, our message using some string interpolation. There's a few different ways you could put this in here, but this tends to be the most popular best practice right now. And then we just call our alert, pass in these options, and that's what causes it to display, like we saw back here. Our title, our message, the interpolation, and then our action button down here. Inside of the dot then, the promise that's returned when you hit OK on the alert, we just threw a console log, but if you needed any additional functionality, you could expand that here. This alert right here, if we scroll up to the top, you'll see is also imported from UI dialogs, TNS Core Module UI dialogs. There's a bunch of other types of dialogs that you can use. There's alert, confirm, options, and if you want to learn more about those, you can dive into the NativeScript docs, or we could explain it a little more in the future. But they work pretty much the same. They'll just have a few more options that you can pass in. And then inside the then, you can handle the responses that are selected. So if we come back over here, you can see our last two UI pieces here are a progress bar and a switch. So I've set these up to be bound to each other, so if you watch, you'll see when I flip the switch down here, our progress bar commences its countdown, and we can flip the switch to turn it back off. And you can see you can just keep going back and forth with that. So I'll explain a little bit now how those are working. So in our HTML, we have our progress bar, and since this one has so many values, I've decided to break it out onto new lines just for a cleanliness sake, a little bit easier to read. So this one as well has a value that we have passed from the HTML one way as the progress value. And then there's this value changed function that's triggered every time the value changes. We just set a max here. You can also set a min value, but we just set it to 100. And then down here, you'll see that there's also our switch, which has a checked value, which we've bound to this progress active variable, class variable, which we'll explain a little more. And it has a checked change event listener that fires our function on switch change. So if we come back over to our TypeScript now, you'll see that we have our onSwitchChanged function down here. So we've done the same where we declare our object of type switch, and then we check that checked variable. If it's true, we want to start the progress on our progress bar. And so up here what that does is first we set progress active to flip the visual and the HTML, and then it starts an interval that just adds 1 to the progress value every 0.3 of a second, or 300 milliseconds. And then if we flip the switch to the other direction, we call stop progress, which then flips the visual using this progress active variable, and then clears the interval and stops this interval from running. So if we come back over here, we can see the progress active is true, the interval is started, we hit this, progress active is false, and we've cleared the interval. So that's just a little explanation on some basic UI components. There's plenty of documentation on these. What I've done doesn't really go much beyond the documentation of NativeScript, but sometimes it's nice to just have a little visual guide. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We'll pause the video and we'll try and answer those as best we can. Okay, moving on to our next page. We're going to come down here to browse. So before I click on this, I'd just like to show you the HTML, a little bit of our browse component. So we have in our browse component very little. We just have 2 NativeScript components. We have an activity indicator, which is just a spinner to display that something's being done, and a web view component. So you'll see here on both of these, I've added this pound and then a name. So this creates a template variable for both of these that you have access to both in your HTML, but also in your TypeScript component through a view child, which I'll show you. And then here on our web view, we have a source attribute, which is one-way data binding to our component and binding to the web view URL variable. Over here in our browse component, like I said, we can access the web view and the activity indicator that are in our HTML using this @viewChild. This is this is from the Angular core package. It allows you to grab an HTML element. You can do it by tag type, by ID, or by template variable name, which is what we're doing here. We pass in a few options. This is new to Angular 8. I won't go into depth on what these are, but it's essentially just saying the type and when to grab it. Then we declare a variable of type element ref, and we've done that for both of these here. And then here's our web view URL string that we have data bound in the HTML. In our ng on init, we go ahead and we set what we want that URL to be. We're just going to go ahead and load the NativeScript Angular docs. And then down here you'll see in this ng after view init, this is a cycle event that you can hit with Angular. So this is after the page has loaded, we want to do a few things. So what we do is, at that point, we'll go ahead and grab the native element, which is the web view itself, and then also the activity indicator. And then we're setting the activity indicator.busy to true, which just starts the spinner. And then we have the web view visibility set to hidden, so that it's not covering up our activity indicator. We then can bind to an event from the web view called loadFinishedEvent, and we're just waiting for that to happen. And once it's finished, we'll go ahead and turn the spinner off and show the web page. And there's just a console log here for us to be able to track that. So now let's go back over here and we can see that all happen when I click on the browse page. You'll see our activity indicator started while it's loading. And then once the page loads, the activity indicator disappears, and we have our web view. So web views are pretty self-explanatory. You just pass a URL, and the web view will load whichever URL you've passed to it. Interaction back and forth is possible. It's a little difficult, but for the most part, you'll just be displaying things inside of a web view. So, and you can go ahead, you can navigate through this just like you would any other web page. And that's the browse component. If we continue down, our next one here is our search component. What we have inside of our search component is a simple search bar at the top, which is the native search bar, and then a list view that displays all the countries in the world. So let's go ahead and look through the HTML and the TypeScript to understand what's happening here. Okay, so let's look at our HTML first. Again, we're just inside a grid layout. We have our search bar component here. We can put a hint in with whatever text we want to display at the top. And then we're doing that same two-way data binding through these two attributes. The text attribute one way from the TypeScript, and the text change one way to the TypeScript. There's also an onSubmit function that you can use, but in our case we're not using that since we're doing live filtering, which I'll display. Then we have down here our list view. With a list view, you pass in your array to this items variable, or attribute, and then inside of there you can go ahead and set up an ng template that is what will be repeated inside of your list view. So we've set it to repeat for each country. We have access then to this country variable. And these are a few other features you can use for displaying different color backgrounds or other things depending on odd or even if you'd like, or if you need access to the index, which we're not using in our case. We then set a scroll view inside of it so that you can scroll through the list view, and then we're just displaying the text, which is just the country name. If we come over here to our search component, we'll show a little bit more. So what we do here is when our page loads, we call in our ng-on-init function, we call init countries. What that does is just sets our countries array to the full list. I won't scroll all the way over, but they're all there. And so if we come back over to our emulator, we have our full list there, our component loaded, and what we've set up is a filter. So if you go ahead and you start typing, you can see it filters down and then restores the list as you go back. Got Bahamas, just keep going back until it displays all including. So I'll break down a little bit what's going on with that filter here. So if you remember, we have our search text change, which is listening to the event listener for any time the text changes inside of the search bar. So what we do in that case is we get a hold of the search bar using that as search bar again. And this is maybe not the best practice, but for our demo purposes, I just went ahead and threw this in. Every time we're just going to set the list back to be the full list. And that's so in case we're backspacing, we get the full list back every time. And then if the search bar text isn't undefined, to make sure when the page first loads, this text change event does fire, but it fires with a text value of undefined. And if that happens, it breaks our filter. So we just threw this if in here to be a little bit more defensive. So then if the text is a string, we'll go ahead and call our filter countries function with that search bar.text. So down here, we take in that and we just do a simple filter. We set our countries array equal to the filtered version if the country name includes our string. And so you can see again how that works and why we're initting every time. It's so that when we hit this backspace, we get all of the possible countries again. There's also our clear all button here, which resets everything. So that's our search bar functionality, just another search bar and list view functionality. So our last page that we're going to go through is the featured. And so what I decided to do here is to demo how to add a NativeScript plugin to your application and then how to use it. So if you come over here to Sidekick, there's a really cool feature that you can use once you're inside your project. Over here on the left, it might be a little hard to see, but there's a plugins option. So what this shows you is both your installed and available plugins. And NativeScript plugins are essentially NPM packages, if you're familiar with that. And you can see in here it lists all the plugins that you currently have installed in your application. And you can search those if you have a lot. And then there's also this Available tab, which searches the NPM registry. So we're going to add the NativeScript camera application. And you can see when it's verified that it's very trustworthy. We currently already have it installed, but if it wasn't, it would just say install here, and you just click this, and it adds it to your project and updates your package.json to contain it. It also provides you the link to their documentation. So I've already gone ahead and done that. So if we come back here, we're running over here. We have a take picture button, and down here we're displaying an image. Right now we just have our default image sitting in place. But if we come over and let's look a little bit at our code and see what this is doing. So in our feature component, you can see the part that we're worried about is just these two lines. What we're doing is displaying that button that just says take picture, just hard-coded text, and on tap we'll call our take picture function. And then down below we have an image. That source is the image source class variable in our TypeScript. So this is really simple. All the magic's really happening inside the TypeScript. So let's go walk through that. So in our take picture function, what we're going to do is we're going to use the camera plugin. If you look up here up top, I've imported the star as camera from NativeScript Camera, which gives me access to that package. If you look at their docs, you'll see that there's a take picture function, which just activates the camera so that you can take a picture with your device. I'm using the async await functions here that were recently added to NativeScript instead of using a .then format for promises. I prefer this because it just keeps your code a little flatter and easier to read as opposed to having to do something more like this would be your alternative. Which is just a lot of code to be able to do the same thing. You add 3 extra lines when you can do it all in the same line. So the await will the value that's returned here in your .then gets returned from the await. So this image asset will be getting set up here. Just a neat little trick, new way to do things. And then once we get our image asset back, what we're doing is using the from asset function that we've imported, you can see up here, from TNS core modules image source. It just takes what the camera gives us, turns it into an asset that that NativeScript can read for us. You can see here I'm declaring that this is going to return something of type promise image source, but since I'm awaiting that, that's going to extract the value for us and setting it to this.image source, which is what we are binding to here on our image. You'll see that I am defaulting it in our ng on init to that default image using the from file, also from the TNS core module image source package. So let's go back over to our emulator, and this is a limitation of the emulator. It can't access the camera since there isn't one. So when we hit take picture in this case, it takes us directly into the camera role, which we can then select an image. And you can see that is now displayed down here. But if we were doing this on our actual device, which if you have the repo downloaded onto your computer, you'll be able to run it on your device, and this will work just the same. And when I show you the Android emulator, it has a way to kind of mock a camera. So that's the basic walkthrough of those steps of the application. If you have any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand. We'll pause the video and take those and answer them as best we can. All right, and now we have our Android emulator here. You can see all of this functionality is using the native components and working just the same. Sorry, my emulator is running a little slow, still starting up. And we'll jump down here to the featured again. So you can see we have our default image and take picture. So this is on the Google Pixel 2 emulator. It has a special functionality where if you take a picture, it sends you into this kind of fake environment. And it allows you to actually take a picture in here. So I'll go ahead and do that. We'll say that picture is good. And you can see it then threw that picture in down here. And with the Google Pixel 2 emulator, you can pan around and show or take a picture of this fake room a little bit. So that's our demo for today. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. We'll answer them as best we can. This video will be uploaded on YouTube if you guys want to be able to watch it again to review it. And if it does well enough, we'll try and make some more YouTube demos explaining more NativeScript features in the future. Thanks.